In this screencast, we're going to talk about methods of irrigation. Now, irrigation is basically putting water on plants so it grows in between times when it rains. So without rain, this is what we get, but with irrigation, this is what we get. So clearly, once people figured this out, we started doing it a lot. In fact, about 70% of the water that's accessed by humans, whether it's taken out of rivers and lakes or out of aquifers, about 70% of it around the world is used for agricultural purposes. And only about 10% of it is actually used for us to drink and wash and bathe with. Uh, and so, we tend to think of this slice of the pie when we think of water, but actually, most of it is used to grow food. And that makes sense. Without food, we die. Without water, we die, but we don't need that much water, but we need plants, and plants need a lot of water, it turns out. Now, one can make the argument that it is agriculture that made us into a civilized society. And prior to that, we were hunter gatherers. But once people learned that they could cultivate land and plant food on it, the next thing was, well, gosh, if it doesn't rain, this food dies and we're screwed. So people said, you know what? Let's figure out how to put water on it. And so, as far as we can tell, the first irrigation started happening between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, probably in the Nile area and in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And it seems like what probably happened was this: these rivers have a flood period, and the water would come out, and then people figure out, like, wait a second, let's prevent the water from going back down when the river drops. And then after that, it became, well, let's distribute it. Let's build canals to get it where we want to go. Let's build little dams so I can control where the water goes. Let's build water lifting devices so I can put more water on there when I need to. And suddenly, the amount of crops that you could sustain increased, which means there was more food, which meant there was more people. And if you recall, we're talking about population graphs we had human population. There's this bump that happened. A noticeable increase in population happened because of an increase in this food resource. And then all over the world, people came up with this idea. Like in Asia, where rice is a popular food crop, a very interesting type of irrigation crop, which is called terraced farming. So people learned that you could take hillsides and basically engineer them to look a little bit differently, so that it was a series of dams, and that the rainwater would start at the top and work its way down. And if you've ever had a chance to go to a rice terrace, it's a wonderful thing. I hope you get to do it. Anytime I travel to a country that has them, I go. I am just fascinated with and just love rice terraces. They're beautiful, they're fascinating, and very clever. But that's not how most of the world agriculture actually deals with irrigation. Most irrigation comes down to these methods here: flood, furrow, spray, and drip irrigation. So the main way that people in the modern world keep water on their plants. So let's just look at each of these in turn and see what the pluses and minuses of each are. So let's talk about furrow. Okay, so a furrow is basically a low area between rows. So when the farm equipment goes, you plant on these high parts, and then the low parts are here so that water can then be allowed to flow down here. So basically, one of the benefits of this is it doesn't take much energy. So you just basically open the pipes and just let water flow across the low points between the furrows, and water will infiltrate the soil and be available to the plant roots. Very simple idea. But there's a couple of problems with it. One is it's really wasteful. A lot of this water is going to evaporate. A lot of it is going to run off your land. And so it's fairly inefficient of water. And not only that, this water is moving. As it comes down here, it's got some motion to it, and that means it's going to pick up soil particles and move them. So erosion is a problem with this type of irrigation method. Now, flood irrigation is where you just basically flood a whole flat area. You just put it under several centimeters of water and just wait for that water to sink into the soil and wet the roots. Now, again, this is fairly inexpensive. You don't have to spray. You don't have to have a lot of equipment. You just basically open up the pipes and let it go. Right? But the water's sitting here in the sun, so it's going to evaporate. So it's pretty high evaporation. A lot of the water that infiltrates doesn't stop at the roots; it just keeps on going. You get this wetting front that moves down, so you are recharging the aquifer underneath the property, but you're putting more soil in than the plants are actually going to be able to access. And oftentimes there is some runoff that occurs from these operations as well. Now, one of the things that is most concerning about this type of irrigation is that it does cause a problem of water logging, which basically means that the um, the surface aquifer comes all the way up to the surface of the water table, reaches the surface, so there's no air in the soil, and this causes some problems that we'll talk about later in the screencast. The most common way in the modern world to irrigate land is to use what's called spray irrigation. Now, spray irrigation, um, it's more expensive. It requires some pretty fancy equipment. It requires pumping, putting it under higher pressure. But it's more conservative of water, so there's a lot less water being lost this way. It does have a fairly high rate of evaporation, but you're not using as much water. And the other thing too is because these little droplets land on plant leaves, sometimes it acts like a little magnifying glass that can damage leaves. But most farmers choose to use this because it is the most efficient use of water, but it's also the most expensive. Well, actually, this is, you know what? It's not the most efficient and it's not the most expensive, but it's the one they choose to use. The most expensive and most efficient is drip irrigation. And because it's so expensive, it doesn't get used that much. Although I notice here in Korea, it does get used quite a bit. In drip irrigation, you have plumbing that has little holes in it that are going to water just where the plant itself is. And so basically with drip irrigation, there's very, very little wasted water. You're not putting any more than the plant needs. You're putting it directly on the plant, not on places where the plant isn't. There's very little evaporative loss. In fact, here in Korea, I notice a lot of times they put vapor barriers over it in terms of like plastic, so you even reduce the evaporation further. So it's a very water efficient method and a very environmentally friendly method. Unfortunately, it is rather expensive, but I do think it's probably going to become more common in the future as water resources become depleted. Now, there's some problems associated with irrigation. Let's just go through them in turn. So basically, the problems are aquifers get depleted as we pump water out of them. Nutrients get leached out of soil by the water. The soil becomes salinized. In other words, it develops a high salt content. The soil also erodes, and it can become waterlogged. Let's look at each of these in turn. So basically, an aquifer, remember, is just a water-bearing rock layer or soil layer in which the pores are filled with water. So here I have a diagram where I have a farm and I have 3 wells here, and here's the blue represents the water, and you can see I'm pumping water here. You get this little what's called cone of depression. Okay, and right now the water, it's being recharged, it's discharging, and it's being used at a sustainable rate. But if this pump here starts pumping a lot in order to do this spray irrigation here, then we develop what's called a large cone of depression. I'm taking a lot of the water out of here, and so the water level begins to drop. These other wells end up going dry, and this aquifer becomes depleted. So if you pump water out of the ground faster than water infiltrates into the ground, you're going to deplete an aquifer. Now, I had to make these pictures myself, so I hope they work for you. Okay, so do you like my artwork? All right, so problems caused by irrigation. One is leaching of nutrients from soil. So the 3 nutrients that farmers mostly use are nitrate, phosphate, and potassium. And so if I put these 3 things here on my soil, so that, each one represents a different nutrient. So normally I put these nutrients in the soil in forms of fertilizer. They're available for my plants, and my plants grow. They can make the cells they need to make because they have all the nutrients they need. But my plants also need water in order to engage in photosynthesis, so I spray water on it. Okay, so here's the water coming in. Pretty good, huh? You probably knew what that was. Well, as I irrigate the land, the water is going to infiltrate the soil, and these are water soluble nutrients, and so they dissolve into the water and get carried downward with it. And what happens is over time, if I keep doing this, the water carries them all the way away from the plant roots, so that the plant can no longer access these nutrients, and they're now down here in the groundwater where they're now a problem, and my plants don't get it. So we call this leaching the nutrients from the soil. Now, another one is salinization. And this one's really very problematic because it makes soil unusable. So what happens is when we irrigate soil, if you were to taste that water, you say, well, this is fresh water. It is, but it still has trace amounts of salts in it. Most water does. It's very unusual. I mean, this is distilled water. There's going to be trace amounts of it. So we have these dots represent ions that are in low concentration that are dissolved in the irrigation water. And so I spray this on. And what happens is Evaporation and transpiration carry water upwards, and as a result, as this moves upwards, water moves up with it through what's called capillary flow, and as that water goes up, and more water leaves it, the salt eventually starts to form crystals at the surface. And so the source of the salt was actually the irrigation water, which wasn't salty, but because over time we keep taking the water out, but we leave these salt ions in. Over time, the salt level in the soil gets to the point where um, the plants can't. I mean, if you remember from osmotic pressure, that what happens is the water wants to leave the plant cells rather than going into it. And at that point, the plants are going to die. Another problem we get is especially with furrow irrigation, is we get erosion. So as water moves down these furrows, you can see it's got some turbidity to it. It's carrying silt and sand with it, or silt and clay particles with it, probably. And so, after a while, we notice we start getting missing soil from our land, and that's just because we're letting the water flow across it too quickly. And then there's waterlogging. So basically, there's two problems with waterlogging. Waterlogging basically means that I fill up all the pores in the soil with water. There's no air in there at all. Okay. Now there's a couple of problems. One is plant root cells. They need to breathe. They need to respire. That means they need atmospheric oxygen, like gaseous oxygen, O2, just like you and I need. And just like you and I would drown if we're underneath water, so do plant root cells. So if you put them completely underwater, most plants can't handle that. The cells die, and the plant dies because it can't get water if its root cells are dead. So that's one problem with waterlogging. The other problem is it causes a decrease in the amount of nitrogen in the soil, and here's why. So nitrification, so nitrogen, um, nitrogen fixing bacteria and nitrifying bacteria. Let's just talk about nitrifying bacteria. Nitrifying bacteria, what it needs is, in order to take ammonia and turn it into nitrates and nitrites, these are aerobic bacteria. They need oxygen to do it. Right? But what happens is if I flood this, now aerobic bacteria die off, but anaerobic bacteria are able to function. Well, anaerobic bacteria are the ones that are responsible for denitrification. I'm not sure what just happened. I guess we're going to end this.